but today we're going to talk about deployment, application deployment with SCCM. So if you remember, SCCM, the System Center Configuration Manager, was a one-stop shop for doing lots of things. Okay, we spoke about deploying operating systems, deploying updates, deploying configurations. Last time we talked about deploying the client, which is a piece of software that gets installed into the operating system and it reports back, as well as receive instructions from the SCCM. So today we're going to continue on, and we're going to talk about deploying applications, and we're going to explain options available for application deployment, detail the various components that's required in application deployment. So as we've sort of learned, or as we sort of been indicating, SCCM incorporates many different components into the system, or the SCCM service, in order to achieve the deployment of operating systems, applications, updates, and configuration of the clients. We need to understand the role and the management of the distribution points. So what they are, what they do, and how they're used in these deployments. As the name suggests, it's a distribution point, meaning that it's a service or area where the client machines can receive this deployment from, okay, at least the files of it. So let's actually have a look at the dependencies of application deployment. So we've been talking about the various management point, distribution point, and there's many other points that we've mentioned before. But if we remind you, the management point is the interface between the clients and assigned sites. Okay, so basically the client is your Windows 10 client machines, for example, on your network, and obviously the site is where they belong, the premises, the network, the subnet that it belongs to in your network. And it's the interface between the client and their assigned site, meaning that this, for the management point, this is how the clients receive instructions and also report status back to the SCCM. Management point policy updates gives clients their assigned settings. So if you don't know what that exactly means, management point is obviously the service here, and the policy updates is the updates to the rules. Okay, update to the rules. The rules could be that we turn on our firewall, or we scan with our Windows Defender antivirus at 3 a.m. every day. They're just some examples of these settings, and basically the management point, if we configure these settings, will push out these settings to the clients who have these that bit of software, the SCCM client software installed. And when the clients receive these instructions, they will then act upon those instructions. Also, the management point is how the clients return data to the site. Okay, so for example, if I wanted to query which clients were active, or which clients have received the updates, or which clients have Windows 10 operating system on there, or many other different queries that we might want to use to find out information about our network or our resources in our inventory. And the client uses the management point to return data. The management point also provides a list of available distribution points to the clients. Meaning, so in our example, in our setup, there's only going to be one management point, one distribution point, because we've kept it simple. And to be honest, it's the same server. Okay, so don't think that it has to be the same server though. Don't think the management point and the distribution point are always the same server. No, they're just elements in your SCCM. Okay, you can have management point with many distribution points on different services, different servers, and obviously they're designed to be able to provide these information to the clients in the most efficient way. So if you have multiple subnets with different types of computers, think of your TAFE SA. You've got your student subnet, you've got your lecturer subnet, you might have your server's subnet, then maybe having a distribution point on only the server subnet might be problematic in the sense that the client computers need to go to this distribution point, a different area of the network to be able to get this information. So maybe place a distribution point on the same subnets as the student networks means it's a more efficient, and also maybe it may be more secure for the client to be able to access these distribution points. But anyway, distribution points are crucial for application deployment. Okay, so as you can imagine, if we need to deploy a program or application, they usually come with installation files. In order to install the program onto the client machines, the clients need to access these installation files. But so obviously the distribution points contain the installation files as well as many other things in order for the clients to use them. It is the location where all remote if a remote to. If a distribution point is not available to the clients, the deployment will fail when the application contains content. As you can imagine, if you're told to install a program, but the client computers cannot access the installation files, it cannot install it. And that's the point of this distribution point, to provide those file content to the clients when they need it. Like we said, we can have multiple distribution points if we want. So multiple distribution points may be present in the primary site, including workstation class machines running Windows 7 or greater. Distribution points are installed for the site, but on servers other than the site server, also known as remote distribution points, may be configured for content throttling. Okay, so like I said, the distribution points might not be on the site servers. It might be on other servers. And these are called the remote distribution point. Okay, and the content throttling means it's just like the speed controlling the speed of the downloads. Wasif asked the question, so let me just address that question. Clients can, well, like we said here, distribution points can be installed on, you can have multiple distribution points. And obviously if your client, from the client's perspective, they'll probably use the single one, but obviously it depends on where the client is. Okay, Wasif, so let's say I'm a lecturer and I am teaching at multiple campuses at TAFE SA. It means that if I'm at the Adelaide site, I will use the Adelaide distribution points. But what if I'm at the Noarlunga site? If I continue to use the Adelaide distribution points, that can be ineffective or inefficient, wouldn't it? So therefore, these distribution points can be based on location like that. It can be based on subnets. It can be based on many other arrangements as well. But from the client's point of view, they are using obviously only one at a time. But as they move from one location to another location, one situation to another situation, then they can use other distribution points as well. So Wasif, does that make sense to you? Does that answer your question? So let's have a read of your question now. For if client distribution point is not working that day, yeah, definitely. You can have multiple distribution points, and if one is down, obviously you can be redirected to distribution points or use other distribution points as well. Is that what you were asking initially? All right, no worries. Hopefully that's addressed his concerns. So, and besides having the management point and distribution point, we need to have that that bits enabled on IIS. So if you forgot, bits is that background intelligent transfer system, and IIS is the Internet Information Services, which is effectively a web server from Microsoft. So it's using that IIS to transfer the files. Okay, and we need the default client settings. Okay, so let's keep on looking at this. So elements of application deployment. So when we deploy an application, so in this example, in this picture, you can see it's a Google Chrome. Okay, so it's going to deploy the Chrome browser to the client machines. Okay, so So we need applications. So administrators build applications in Configuration Manager to describe the software that is going to be deployed. The administrators create an application to specify details regarding the application. So if we have a look at this, we've got many tabs, and obviously in our labs we'll be using some of this to we'll be configuring some of these. But if we look at what's here in this example, it's the name is what we type in. It's in this case is Google Chrome. The owner in this case is the administrator. It's created by administrator. The status is active. It's not being superseded. Revision 1, so it's the first time. So if you look at this, if this wasn't suggesting something, it just means that, hey, if we deploy an application today, as we know, updates come out all the time. So what we can do is we can update this application with the next one or another one, and in this case, this will become inactive and it will become superseded by the next version. So deployment types. So if we look at this is using the MSI file. So most of you will be familiar with the idea of MSI, Microsoft Installer Files. And if you remember, for those of you who've done the 4IMWS subject with us, if you remember, when we deploy software from group policies, we have to use MSI files. And if you remember, we can convert normal exe files or executable files into MSI files. So what the MSI files are preferred, definitely, but with SCCM, we can use other types of files as well. But one of the biggest reasons why MSI files is preferred is it's actually resilient and self-healing. What it means is that it's actually going to keep a reference to where the MSI files is. And let's say you just deleted a whole bunch of files, including some of the parts of the installed application, but you still have the shortcuts or you still have the file associations. So basically with the MSI files, when you double click on the shortcut or the file associations, it will detect that there's missing parts or the components is broken, but it will know that it installed this program from a proper location, from a set location. And if those MSI files are still there at that location, it will actually reinstall it and fix the installation. So it's actually, in that case, resilient. It also supports proper uninstallation, meaning that if you remember from some of your experiences, sometimes you install a program, you uninstall it, but it's still got little bits and pieces hanging around, okay? And that's sometimes annoying because you don't fully remove it, even though you think you've uninstalled it. But with an MSI file, it's actually supports safe uninstallment and full uninstallment. And if you look at your computers, okay, so this is what some people have done in the past. So if you look at your computers, you'll realize in the Windows folder, you have a lot of MSI files. Okay, bear with me. It's searching for MSI. But basically, your computer, when you're installing some of these programs and updates, will have a whole heap of MSI files located on your computer. Like I said, it needs reference to where the MSI files were. And sometimes you're tempted because you're running out of space. Okay, I'm wondering why this is taking so long. Let's go up one level and let's go search for MSI files again. Sometimes you're tempted to delete these MSI files because they're actually so big or takes up a lot of space. But you'll find that you're going to actually break your system or break your file associations and your programs if you actually delete these MSI files. Here we go. So it's in that Windows System 32 and the Windows folder. and there should be a lot more. So my computer is actually just taking its time searching it up, but I'll show you the results later. All right, so let's continue. So in this case, it's the same example. It's the Google Chrome, and it's actually we're using the MSI installation file for Google Chrome here. It's actually we've actually provided installation file. So the deployment types provide additional details for how a given application should be handled in various situations, what type of action to take when the application is being deployed to various types of devices or users. Deployment type describes ways to detect if an application is already installed or whether the command lines are needed to remove the application. So, so deployments. Okay, so this is deployment type. Deployment is the mechanism that associates an application deployment type with a collection of users or devices. Okay, this sounds a little bit confusing. All right, so just because you created a deployment type doesn't mean it's going to be used to install on anything just yet. It's just sitting there. It's ready to go. It's got the files. It knows how to install it, but it's not actually deployed, if you know what I mean. So deployments, when we deploy a software, so when we actually, you'll see in our lab, when we actually deploy it, we actually have to select who or what we're deploying to. So that's why not necessarily every application you set up here in this way is going to be deployed to every computer or device on the network. So by configuring deployments, you are selecting based on either the device or the users that you want to deploy it to. The deployment is not created as part of building the application or deploying a deployment type. It's connecting, if you like, it's connecting this application and deployment type to a set of devices or users. Okay. For example, you could deploy Chrome to only the student users, or you could deploy Chrome only to classroom A103 computers. But it doesn't mean that that deployment type or that application that's been set up can't be used again and again and again in different ways. Basically, it's like when you're cooking, you have all these ingredients in a recipe. So if you like in cooking, you get this ingredient, that ingredient, you combine it to make this specific recipe. The deployments or the deployment type and the deployments are like ingredients in the recipe. You can use these ingredients over and over again for many different recipes or many other different deployments, but you can it's how you combine them to get a desired result. Deployments are created by selecting deploy option from the ribbon when focused on a particular application or console. Okay, let me just quickly switch over to my, no, let's see. All right, as you can see, I've got plenty of MSI files in my C Windows installer specifically. Let's try that. No, sorry, I might have no S. C, yep. I'm missing a whole Windows directory path. And basically in here, in these folders, as well as these areas here, you can see there's lots and lots of MSI files. You can see some of these are actually quite big, 200 megs, 150 megs, and it's a bit, like I said, it's a bit tempting to just delete them. But don't, okay? So that's what I'm saying. Don't delete these MSI files because they're actually linked or referenced to applications that's running on your computer. And if you delete these, you'll find that some of your programs actually won't work properly because of that fact. Sorry, that was a question there. Let me just see what the question was. Deployment type can be for every software, and it's one time only. And deployments is where we want to. Uh, so I think I understand what your question is. Was if so basically deployment types is not one time only. It's just a part of it. It's on how to deploy this software. But we can use this, let's say, for deploying software to room A103 computers. Okay, then we use the deployment type with the deployment to give this software to the A103 computers. But no, it's still there. It's that the deployment type is still there. It's still there to be used again. So let's say we decide, hey, we're not just going to deploy to 103. We're going to do another deployment, and now we're going to do it for the library computers. So we can again create a new deployment that uses that deployment type, but now for the library computers. You can see how we can take the different elements and use it over and over again in different situations. So it's not one time. It's sitting there as long as it's effective. It's what you need for what you want to achieve. That's the key thing. Knowing what you want to achieve. You'll see that a lot of these things that we're talking about in SCCM is modular. So we take, if let's say we got a definition of computers or computer groups, we can define these computer groups to be used for operating system deployment. We could use it for software deployment. We could even use it for rules, policy deployment, update deployment. So we can use it over and over again. With this deployment type for that Google Chrome, we can use it over and over again as long as it fits what we need for the different situations we find ourselves in, what we want to achieve. You get me, Wasif? So it's not one time. We use it as many times as we need, as long as it's suitable for what we need to do. So the next part, and deployments is where we want to, okay. So I think that answers your question. All right, so the application deployment process, requirement to have application deployed to a collection. So again, like I said, these collections is how we define the groups or the objects we want to deploy it to before the deployment can begin. So again, the collection is another ingredient in our recipe. We can't do the deployment just yet unless we've already created the collection beforehand. It's just like you cooking and you're preparing all your ingredients, so it's all there. And when you're ready to cook, which is the final deployment, you can use a bit of this and a bit of that, and you combine it together to use in your recipe. Okay, the concept of requirements. So we define the rules of deployment within the deployment itself, rather than build a specific collection to do the same. The load of evaluation is moved from the site server to the individual client. So which means like, do I fit the rule? So instead of actually the site server scanning the computer and working out if that client computer fits the requirements of what we're looking for, we are pushing that load to the individual clients as well, so they assess themselves, if you like. Let's say one of the requirements is that it must have i5 CPU, it must have 16 gigs of RAM. Then instead of the site server looking through all the clients, working out if they do have these things, as you can see, imagine if the site server is doing that for all the clients in the whole network, that's a lot of work. Whereas if we do this use this requirements process, it means, so as part of the deployment, we can configure what's called requirements. So there's no point installing VMware Workstation on a computer that has 4 gigs of RAM, for example, because we know that's not going to be useful. So maybe the requirement for VMware Workstation is that it has 16 gigs of RAM or something like that. Let's just pretend that that's our requirement. So therefore, before the client actually deploys the software, it's going to check itself. It's going to evaluate itself to see, do I meet the requirements? So once a requirement rule is defined, it is retained and it's reusable. So again, like I said, it's like the concept of ingredients in a recipe. Once we create a requirement rule, we can use it again in another recipe. let's say we have this 16 gigs of RAM as the requirement, which as the main thing of this requirement rule, and we use it for the deployment of VMware workstations. There's nothing to say that we can't use this requirement rule, which says needs 16 gigs of RAM, let's say Adobe Photoshop, if that's what we need. Okay, we have to find where we can reuse it again, and we can just reuse it as we need it. Then we create a pre-stage content file. So pre-stage content file is basically the contents of the installation, and pre-stage is before staging. Okay, staging. The idea of staging is that's common across all of IT, not just in this content. It's to do with actually deploying or transferring files. So I think for those of you who did the 4IMWS subject with me, we spoke about the DFS. Okay, DFS is a service where it's called distributed file system. It's basically replicates files from one file server to another file server, and that can be across the WAN link even. But with that, instead of actually it replicates changes. So instead of actually replicating every change every second, as soon as that happens, there's actually an amount of change that builds up in a staging folder before it actually gets transferred. So if you like, the staging is basically where we actually hold things temporarily before they're actually sent off. Okay, so when we're about this creating a pre-staged content file, the challenges of a distribution point are made worse when distribution points are positioned across a slow or busy WAN connection. So when a distribution point supports a pre-staged content, administrators are able to choose the application that should be made available in a pre-staged content file, along with all the dependencies, which can be copied locally onto the remote distribution point without the need for the use of the expensive WAN connection. So what does that mean? It means that, hey, if this application is going to be distributed from this distribution point, we need to get the files itself, the contents of the distribution onto the distribution point. Okay, so we could be administering our SCCM from our office at the central site, but obviously the clients we want to deploy, let's say this software to, might exist on the no longer campus. We've created a deployment, we created all the requirements of the deployment, but they have to somehow get across to the no longer distribution point so that the clients can access them. And if let's say the connection between the Adelaide site and the no longer site is very slow, it just means that that's going to happen very slowly, and it might be expensive because we might be charged, if in this situation we might be charged for the amount of data that goes through that WAN link. So what this pre-stage when we're talking about this pre-stage content, what we can do is we can actually take it on a portable hard drive, let's say, potentially. Take it to that site and put it on that distribution point without needing that WAN link. So this is pre-staging, means that the distribution point has all the contents it needs in order to give the clients the installation or this deployment. Configuring the pre-stage content supports requires settings the option of on the distribution point. So we need to configure the option on the distribution point. So pre-staging means it gets all the content first and before it pushes out. The application deployment process, we can create the deployment type. For a given application, it is possible to create multiple deployment types. Okay, so for the same program, you might be deploying in many ways. We can also retire and reinstate. So what does that mean? It means that if we have a program that's a little bit old, we can retire it. So as in it's no longer being deployed. A reinstate is the opposite. So if we have something that's retired and we want it to be deployed again, we can actually reinstate it. The option to retire an application marks an application is no longer deployable without deleting it. There are a few advantages of this approach. The application deployment status is not removed, as in it's still there. It just means it won't be deployed. Details about the application configuration can be viewed because it's still there. You can look at all the elements of it and look at it and maybe investigate it or base our new deployments on this. And we can quickly reinstate the application to an active status easily and quickly. What does that mean? It means what if we decide, oh, this program is a bit old, let's retire from deployment, or we don't want this anymore. Let's actually just delete it. Well, if we delete it, it's gone, isn't it? It's gone. And what if we accidentally delete it? We sort of got confused, we deleted the wrong thing, and then it's no longer there. We have to create everything from scratch again. So, but whereas if we use the retire and reinstate, it means, sorry about that, guys. It means that we can actually take a deployment offline, and if we made that as a mistake, or we realize that we didn't need to retire it, we can actually reinstate it. Okay, so if we deleted it, so the delete application will be tied to each other through dependence and supersedence relationship. So supersedence means there might be newer versions of it. When these relationships exist, or when there is a deployment defined for an application, the deletion will fail. So therefore, what does that actually really mean? You cannot delete something that's still being used. It's a bit like you deleting a file that's open by a program. You can't do that. It's being used. So before you can actually delete an application, you have to make sure that there's actually not being used in any deployments. There's no relationships that exist as far as the supersedence or as a dependency. We can do what's called a simulated deployment. So basically, this is just so we can test our settings. So we can perform a test deployment of a configured application only to validate the association relationship. So it's not actually gonna do the deployment on any physical computer or real computer. What it's actually gonna do is actually gonna test all the components of the deployment is there, is working, it's connected, and it will work. So after testing the simulated deployment needs to be deleted to be deployed on the actual application to the same collection. Okay, so if we look at this picture, we're actually choosing the application, choosing the collection. In this case, this collection represents all users, and we are doing an install, and basically this will run through a testing the components. Like I said, it's a recipe that uses many ingredients. That's an analogy we've been using. It's basically saying this testing simulated deployment is just making sure that all our ingredients are there, ready to go. It's making sure that it's all configured correctly and it's all good to go. We can also export. Okay, export shares almost any configuration, including application definitions between configuration manager hierarchies. So what does that mean? That means if I've configured in my configuration manager here, but it's part of a larger hierarchy, I can export it out of mine and import it into another. Okay, let's think about that in a sort of example. Let's say we've got the whole of government, and we've got TAFE SA, and let's say they were all linked together in some SCCM hierarchy of deployments, and let's say this software is required by every branch of government. Let's say it's like let's say it's a software that's required by every branch of government, so therefore it needs to be deployed in every government institution. So we could, it's possible that we could export it if we create it as part of the TFSA deployment. We could export this, and we can actually share it with the other branches of government, and they can then import it and use it without reconfiguring everything. It's also a form of extra backup. So if you export it, you keep it on file somewhere and you accidentally delete it or you break parts of it, you can actually import it and restore it. We can also deploy. So obviously this is to trigger action. A deployment is needed. So if we created all these things, it might be all ready to go, but until we deploy it, it's not going to go onto any computer or onto any user's device. Deployments are not created as part of the create application wizard. It's not part of the wizard. The wizard creates individual parts of it, and we must actually deploy it through the deploy. Must configure it through the deploy wizard in order to create the deployment. Distribute content. So, like I said, this deployment of an application has content, has installation files, has configuration policies. To make the content available to clients by staging on a distribution point. Remember, staging means collecting all that information. It's almost a temporary, it's holding it there so they can be used. So by distributing the content, we are staging the content, staging the files, the contents. At this stage, we will say that though this option is useful to stage the content to distribution points, it isn't strictly required. So staging is having the content, all of it, at the distribution point ready to go. But to be honest, we can deploy it without the content already staged. It just means it's the whole process is going to be if it's not already staged, it just means that it needs to each distribution point needs to get the content before it can start distributing it to the client. So it just means the process is actually a little bit slower. But you'll see in our labs, we'll definitely distribute the content before we deploy it. And that way, it means it means the distribution points will have the content already. So hopefully, the whole process is a little bit faster, and we're not waiting to see the distribution, to see the deployment, and waiting for all these things to happen in the background. So we're trying to make it as straightforward as we can. By defining distribution point groups to include collection mappings, when a collection is targeted with a deployment, the content needed will automatically be deployed to the defined distribution points. So what does that mean? It means like I said, if we had a distribution point for student computers, for example, student computers, if you like, is the collection. The collection is the group of devices, users, resources that assets, if you like, that we want to push out content, whether that's deployment of software, applications, operating systems, or even policies. And what this is saying is by defining distribution points groups to include collection mapping. So if we map the student computers, let's say at TAFE, to the distribution point that's on the student subnet, let's say, it means that when we actually we'll automatically deploy the content to the defined distribution points when we actually create the deployment. Move. We can move applications between defined folders. We can. This helps keeps things organized. Obviously, like you can imagine your own file system. If you don't organize it properly, it becomes a mess. And if you don't, you probably sometimes after a while you realize that I should have organized it like this instead of the way I have. But basically, by using the move function, we can actually move the applications from wherever they are to another area to help organize our servers. This is not something that the client's going to see. They're not going to know that this is happening in the background. They just get their software. We can also set security scopes. Okay, so security scopes is the assignment of user roles and the ability to mark some objects such as applications as being part of one or more defined security scopes. Configuration Manager console users can be assigned one or more security scopes. By this, you can limit what the users can see. Okay, so this is This is talking about almost that idea of delegation. If you don't have permission, if you like, you may not even be able to see the parts that you're not in charge of. Categorize, so having categories. So assign categories to applications for the purpose of organization. So this is like, for example, that Chrome could be in a category of browsers, or could be in, you can define the categories actually. You can define it as SOE. If you've never heard of the term SOE, standard operating environment. So you can categorize some software based on whatever categories you want to have. If it's part of SOE, then that might be something that's deployed to every station. Whereas if it's deployed to multimedia users or IT users or network users, for example, networking students, it might be like, for example, the VMware workstation might be categorized under networking students. And that way, it's only then it's easy to recognize that it's actually for networking students. But you can choose your categories. You don't have to come up with those ones. Those are more functional categories in the sense of where we're using it for. But we can create categories based on a whole heap of software. These are browsers. These are, let's say, desktop applications. These are monitoring tools, etc., etc. Properties. This option, categories. Categorize options allows for category management. Properties. This option will open the properties dialog box for the selected deployment. So let's have a look at this, the client experience, okay? So the client experience, what does the clients actually see? So this is that software center. The ultimate goal of the application deployment is to take action on configuration manager clients. So the clients in our network. The configurations will make the application available for install in the software center for all targeted clients. The application will by default not show up in the user-centric application catalog. Inclusion in the application catalog requires that the application be deployed to a collection of users or user groups. So here, when it's talking about user-centric, it's where the user is the focus, at the center. So in order for that to show up in that application catalog, it must be deployed to a group of users or the user. So from a point of view of the user or the user experience, you can see that in its software center, you can see that there's in this case, application called Foxit Reader available. Its publisher, it's available as of a certain date. It's available now. So if I show you an example of software center, I know I'm at home, which is a little bit different to the situations like this. If we actually look at this applications, Firefox, for example, you can see that that's available. The version is 68.7. The date published is not specified in this case, and it's actually might be required to restart. It gives us a little bit information. The last time it was modified was on the 22nd of April, so probably just an update in version, and the time it's going to take is 20 minutes. From a user's point of view, I click install, and you notice I'm at home, aren't I? Even though I'm at home, remember we can incorporate the SCCM into the cloud, if you remember right at the start. So you can see that this is the cloud. I'm getting this content now, not from the normal distribution point. So if you remember, you asked, can I switch? Can I have multiple distribution points? Yes. You can see that in this case, my situation is that I'm not on the work site. I'm at home. But yet, I'm actually downloading and now installing this Firefox browser. And that's because I'm actually getting the content on my computer here from the cloud distribution point that can be tied into the SCCM. Okay, so that's going to install. I won't cancel it. I can't cancel it right now, unfortunately. And that says it's going to take 20 minutes. So I'll let it go, and we'll go back to our PowerPoint. So Windows application package, so deploying Windows app package for Windows 8.x or 10 or RT devices can be done in two different ways. We can install the application from the online Windows Store. So if you remember, we spoke about this. We spoke about the idea of the Windows Online Store, which again, oops, I went to the wrong place. So if you remember, we talked about the online store. So this is, I think most of you are familiar with this in the sense that the online store is effectively the app store. The app store for, just like the app store from your Android or iOS devices, but in this case, it's a Microsoft store. And if we deploy it through the Windows Store, it appears in our Microsoft Store. And then it's, even though it's a Microsoft Store, it's actually still under TFSA, and I could actually deploy software like Whiteboard, FreshPaint in this case, to my computer. And as this was if talked about here, so is it prioritized on server? So what do you mean there? Was if, so you have access to a distribution point, and if that's not available, then there's alternative distribution points. And also that's dependent on your situation. Like I said, if you're on one location, you'll use the local distribution points, other than if you were in another location. Like I showed you here on my computer, my location is my home, so that's going to use the cloud distribution points. Yeah, that's automatic based on my computer, my client computer, determining what subnet it is on and using the configuration policies that's of the distribution points that's available. Okay. All right. So like I said, there's two different ways. We can install it into the Windows Store, or we can install it into from a distribution point called loading an application. And here's that. This is the package browser, and we can get app. So that's that method, and the side loading key specifies the side key of this Windows 10, Windows 8, sorry, in this case. So this is comparable, guys. This is comparable to your Android App Store. You guys know that if you want a new app, you go to App Store, you find that, and you install it. But do you guys know that you don't have to go to the App Store to install apps on your Android device? You guys know that, don't you? Who uses it in this room right now? Does any of you guys use Android for your phones or tablets? Yeah, a couple. Not you, Reese, and Malcolm used to. These guys do, and that's good. And Gerard definitely does as well. So yeah, so basically for those of you, so yeah, you can install from APK files, and basically that's directly installing on your device. So basically, if we're talking about these Windows apps, which is effectively the apps that's in our Windows Store, we can install it, deploy into the Windows Store, like we said, and we can find it through going to our Windows Store. Or if we can deploy it directly from our distribution point, instead of going through the Windows Store, that's called side loading. And side loading is a term that's used for like deploying that from APK files or from an alternative location instead of your Android store, for example, your Play Store, whatever it's called. What about Mac OS? Configuration Manager supports the deployment of Mac OS X applications as well. Deploying the Mac OS X application is done with the new Mac OS X deployment type, but has the following limitations. So there's some limitations. So as you can imagine, Windows, Microsoft, they're all sort of tightly integrated, and it's designed to work in a Windows Microsoft environment. No problems. But just because it says we can use Mac OS X and deploy apps to Mac OS X, it doesn't mean it's going to do it in a degree of, as well as they can do it on Windows devices, as you can imagine, because one is software and programs and operating systems they own, and it's primarily designed for. But the Mac OS and as well as the Linux are extra functionality, and I would say it's very basic. Okay, so there's limitations. So first of all, you need to convert the application package to the format that configuration management manager can support. For example, DMG, MPKG, .pkg, or .app files. So outside of those, you cannot use any of those other files. You have to convert it to one of those. You can convert the Mac application package with the CM utils tool that comes with the configuration manager client for the Mac OS X platform. So there's a program that does it, but you've got to do it. Applications cannot be deployed to users, but only to devices. So in a Mac environment, it cannot be user-centric, so it cannot follow the users. So it doesn't matter where which computers you log onto. None of the programs follow you. It follows the device. Like I said, there's limitations. Mac application support simulated deployments allows you to test your requirement rules. Global conditions are not supported when you create deployment types for Mac OS X. All deployment must have a purpose of required, so which means it cannot be available. It has to be required, which means it will definitely be installed. So there's no software center available for Mac OS X. So there's nothing for you to go see and look at what software is available. Everything is required, meaning everything is forced and installed onto your systems. The background intelligent transfer system is not supported by Mac computers. So when a download of the content file fails, or if it fails, the entire download must restart. It's like you can't resume, if you like. Wake on LAN via the deployment is not supported Mac computers. So if you don't know what Wake on LAN is, that's the ability to turn on a computer by sending a network packet through network with the MAC address of the computer. And obviously that's important when we're deploying operating systems or programs to systems that might not be online at that time. Let's say we have a maintenance window of 9 p.m. to 12 midnight, let's say, but the users turn off their computers when they go home. Well, if they're off during the maintenance window, we cannot do these deployments, for example. Let's see, there was a couple of questions just before. Let's see if we can answer that. All right, so Sukraj says, can we install exe files in the same manner we do MSI files? Yes, the configuration manager supports exe files as well. But like we said, that it prefers MSI files, and we can definitely convert exe files to MSI files. Can you use exe? Yeah. So Malcolm answered that question anyway. Sorry, I just got to that question a little bit late because I was talking about something else. And Linux and Unix application, like I said, it provides some functionality to Linux and Unix, but it's definitely not the native environment. Anything we do with Linux and Unix, it's a bonus, really. It's not a mandatory requirement. So see, again, there's limitations. When you need to deploy an application to Linux or Unix servers, you will need a classic package and programs instead of an application. Okay, with this classic packages, you can deploy new software operating system patches and software updates for programs that are already installed on the system. So they're already installed. When you when deploying a Unix or Linux application to a server, you need to keep the following in mind. So just the first thing to take out of this is that it's treating these Linux and Unix as server computers, meaning they're not meant for the users, meaning they're servers in your environment. So there's not many of them, first of all, and they're providing a specific service, and they're not specific to any client users. When deploying Linux or Unix applications to servers, you need to keep the following in mind. You should learn how to use and manage Linux or Unix for the scripts that can be used to deploy the software updates. So it's going to incorporate the scripting. So you should know how to do it already. You can run only native Linux and Unix commands. So even though you guys might have learned all about PowerShell and this and that, they're not going to work on Linux, obviously. Then they have to be the native commands. It can't be. You'll know that some commands are available in some distributions, but not others, because they're not native commands, or there might be aliases that's only in some certain distributions. If you've used Linux much, you can only run run only scripts that are already located in this, on the Linux or Unix server, which means that if you want to run a script, you must place the script on the server first before you can use the configuration manager to execute those scripts. You can only create a program for a specific operating system by selecting the option. This program can run only on the specified platform. So it has to be specific to the platform you're talking about. So when we're talking about Linux, Unix, we know that there's so many different flavors or distributions. So you need to make sure that probably the easiest way is to use a consistent distribution. Don't use 10 different distributions of Linux on your systems. The configuration manager client for Linux and Unix does not support deployment of scripts that make the user environment configuration changes. So you can't, the scripts can't change the user configuration or user environment. The network access account is used to download the content from the distribution point. So basically, this is saying that you must have an account that has the power, if you like, to access the information or download it. So you can't just use any. You can use various Linux users, but the user that you need to access the distribution point must have powers. So probably that user account must exist in Active Directory. Only deployments with a required purpose are supported. Again, there's no software center, meaning anything that you deploy to Linux and Unix is required, which means they're definitely installed and they're not optional. Included file types in the scripts that are supported on the destination operating system, so they must be supported. So web applications. So web applications is a link to a website. This deployment type installs a link on the user's device. Okay, so it's almost like the idea of where you guys install an app for a program. It really just on your phone. Sometimes those apps just take you to the website of that company. Like for example, if you use the eBay app, really it's connecting that your to the eBay website. Not actual much of the app is working on your systems at all. There's user and device affinity. User device affinity. Affinity, if you remember, is that love of. Okay, affinity. I have an affinity for this workstation because I use it all the time. Okay, so if you're the, so it determines whether you're the primary user or not the primary user of a device. Users, regardless of what device they are using, have a consistent experience. Okay, so for example, when you guys go to a computer in the TAFE environment, you'll see that it doesn't matter which one you jump on, you have a consistent look and feel about it. You have the same environment, same software, same desktop, all that kind of stuff. E.g., if a user logged onto the primary device, then the application may be configured to be installed on the target system. If the user simply logs onto a shared computer, they may instead receive a virtualized copy of the application. If the user logs onto a mobile device, a mobile version of that application is available. So user device affinity allows a user to be associated with the primary device and configured in one of several ways. So which is my primary device? So for example, for me at TAFE, I use the computer in the classroom, but is that my primary device? Probably not. I also may use a mobile device to connect to the network. I also have my laptop, which I use at my desk, which is my primary device. So the user can configure that a device should be considered their primary device in the application catalog. So we can say this is my primary device. The administrator can configure the My Device option in the application catalog. So obviously, when they allocated my laptop to me, they might have classified as my primary device. We can use a file to map a user to their primary device and then import this file to the configuration manager. We can also import a user affinity settings. So these are settings to say device affinity. So which one do I love the most? Which is available. So, or we can automatically build a user to primary device mapping based on information collected about the device used by the user. So reporting, which one am I logged in the most? Okay. Configuration manager can be configured to automatically detect the primary device mapping through usage data. Manually create a relationship between users and devices. Definitely, we can edit the primary device node on the console. We can also, specific to mobile devices, when user enrolls a device, a relationship is automatically created between the user and the mobile device. So when we're talking about enrolling a mobile device, it's really getting the certificates when we actually use on the mobile device to actually access the services. All right, guys, so that's the end of the presentation. What we need to work on is the deployment worksheet, the software deployment worksheet. And I know some of you guys, there you go, this is our Firefox installed.